And I forget the name of the book, I apologize, I should have written it down, but there's lots of good articles about it. And because Chavez also gave Bush a book, and it was the,
Probably have to have pictures of it.
oh, what's the, not Churchill, it'll come to me.
The book is called The Open Veins of Latin America, 5 Centuries of the Pillage of a Continent.
The Open Veins of Latin America, 5 Centuries of the Pillage of a Continent. And he gave it to him in Spanish, and I was like, great book, I'll definitely read it.
In Spanish.
In Spanish. It's like, because you can just see the smirk on his face, like, ha ha, gotcha. So I'm going to quickly go, so those are all the advantages, and I've only sort of talked about what economic engagement is, and then just sort of like categories for advantages, and with not a lot of depth, I mean, each of those will go. So these are some of the disadvantages to engaging. And before I sort of start, I put a picture of Chavez here because there are not a lot of them that I think are good that apply to economic engagement, because to be honest, the notion that the reasons we shouldn't engage with Cuba and the reasons we shouldn't engage with Mexico, they have nothing to do with one another. These are not very thematic, and you'll notice this when I get to the history set. It's like, Cuba's a country we haven't traded with in 5 decades, that we once tried to invade. They once tried to store nuclear weapons on them. We just literally don't interact with them at all. Mexico is a government that, you know, we trade with every day, more than just about anyone. We have a border that we monitor, etc., a huge one of our biggest economic and political partners in the world. And then Venezuela is on a different continent than either of those 2 countries, hates us, and is going through a major election cycle to determine their future. So a lot of the reasons why you should and shouldn't will be specific to the country. So your Mexico debates are going to be a lot different than your Cuba debates, going to be a lot different than your Venezuela debates. But these are just sort of like disadvantages or reasons why engaging is probably bad. The first is the category of appeasement. This appears in that Haas article that I was referencing for you. And the best definition I could come up with for appeasement is a diplomatic policy of making political or material concessions. So giving up something politically or materially to someone. It usually refers to giving it to someone who doesn't deserve it, or as this cartoon suggests, it's like giving something up. It's like negotiating with terrorists. You all have heard that phrase, you know, like the United States does not negotiate with terrorists. I think it's said in like every season of 24 ever or something like that. Well, a lot of appeasement is the notion that why would you engage with the bad guy? It's sort of the old notion that I said that we punish countries that are bad and are doing bad things. It's a signal to other powers is the reason that appeasement is bad. If we start engaging with Cuba, if we start engaging with Venezuela, it's a suggestion to people like North Korea or Iran or any other country that's considering it that bad behavior is the best way to get gifts. So while the natural response that you may have is, why would you be mean to a bad guy? Shouldn't we be nice and give them lots of money and make us like us? Is because that's an incentive for other countries to then do very bad things. The number one example cited in all of the get rid of the Cuban embargo literature is a reference to the fact that we started trading with communist China, but our major argument for not trading with Cuba is they're communist. And that was just kind of an example of how that act of appeasement definitely appears in all of the literature. Basically, the Cuban government is saying, well, wait a minute, you started trading with the Chinese, why not us? And so the argument would be that the North Koreans, you know, Jong-un was going to be like, so you're trading with Cuba now? Why can't we get some love? This argument is obviously pretty silly for Mexico. There would be no such thing as appeasing Mexico. To be honest, it's pretty silly in general. Most of this literature is pretty old, this act of appeasement. I mean, we respond to this the same way your parent responds to your brother or sister getting something you don't. It's like, sorry, life's not fair. You know, it's like there's no really actual impact to Iran being bad, and people don't make a decision to be a good guy or bad guy based on what sort of economic engagement we're giving Cuba. But, you know, it is a disadvantage to actually engaging them. Second, and this is sort of a huge chunk of this literature, is capitalism or economic growth bad? As soon as I made the argument that economic growth is sometimes good for the environment, Stephen chastised me for the entirety 10 minutes of the break and made me read evidence about how economic growth is really terrible for the environment and it does evil things. Engagement suggests that we have something to teach these countries about the way they should run their economy. One of the disadvantages to that is maybe our model just isn't that good. This is the fundamental question of the resolution. You should talk to Turner about it. Economic engagement begs the question of whether we have a model worthy of engaging them about. Do we really want them to have the economies like the United States? Is our model all that good? Is capitalism all that friendly? A phrase you will see a lot is one of these. It's hands-off, which means allowing things to happen organically. This appears a lot in the political economist stuff. It says we should just remain hands-off. Their countries, let them go through their natural progression, that democracy and growth, these things are the natural state of the affairs, and just sort of like stay out and this will happen. Top down versus bottom up. Top down is always a phrase. It's like you force it. There's one person that's sort of like making everyone do it. And bottom up is just sort of like the people at the bottom will just sort of raise up and change the system and the way that it should happen. So there's lots of good literature that Mexico is improving because they're not in all of the ways that they're not like the United States. And Cuba's actually done okay without the U.S. embargo. And they're certainly getting a lot better. The environment, insert the other things like manufacturing lots and lots of goods and tearing down the Amazon rainforest and, which includes part of Venezuela, or Cuba becoming a huge tourist destination would probably be bad for their economy. Yes, sir?
What was bottom up?
Bottom up is when there's a change by the people to the government structure. So Cuba is a great example. Top down would be Castro, Raul Castro saying, new policy, boom, everyone follow it. Bottom up would be, even though he's in charge, all of the people on the ground in Cuba are making changes to their own system, their own way. They're not being told to do anything in a particular way. They're just sort of figuring it out. And if you've got 1 million people demanding something and one dictator telling them to do something different, slowly there's a change from the bottom upward. Or organic is another phrase that you'll see, not referring to vegetables without pesticides, but referring to change that occurs naturally. The environment is hurt by engagement. And then poverty inequality. I talked about the north-south gap. Mexico has high poverty rates. Cuba has disputed poverty rates. Venezuela is going back and forth. But, there's also poverty here in the United States. We actually have a very high poverty rate. So why would we want to engage their economies and teach them to be more like ours? In addition to capitalism or growth being bad, there will be a set of arguments that focus around the relations or legitimacy being bad. Soft power is only good if the person who has it isn't evil. So me having soft power over Jason is good as long as you think that I'm a good guy that's going to talk Jason into doing good things. But if I use my soft and hard power to get Jason to go murder puppies, all of a sudden it's not a good thing for me to have any soft power. You don't want to be evil. So a good set of negative arguments might be that the United States having relations or an image with Latin America is bad because we're going to do things like the war on terror or turn Cuba into an even larger prison, or the war on drugs, or other things that have not been all that successful. Examples of negative things we would get Latin America to do are vote with us in UN votes, or spread bad forms of trade or economic engagement, or kick China out. Maybe we don't want the Chinese to be all that kicked out of the country. In fact, maybe the Chinese model of influence and growth is good. A lot of people say it's really good for China to keep growing for the global economy. We shouldn't think of the economy anymore as like U.S. versus China, but we should think about the economy globally. And if it's good for the Chinese economy, it's probably good for us. Why can't we all be friends?
Yeah.
Do I? Oh, the Chinese are good people. Am I right?
Nice.
Finally, some people say America's bad. A lot of misguided people in this world. One of them is Stephen. Basically, the United States hasn't actually stopped that much violence, but is responsible for a lot of violence and terrorism and hatred. And the more powerful we get, the more likely those things become. This will obviously be a set of arguments. Basically, all of these arguments should seem counterintuitive to you because they're all dumb, but they're very popular in debate because, honestly, the resolution is like, hey, America should look better internationally. One of the natural responses you should have to that is, no, we shouldn't. You know, it's very, very logical. You say X, I say, how about not X? Another disad is the budget. Does economic engagement have to cost money? No, it doesn't. I mean, the first email I exchanged with Will Mosley Jensen about like, all right, let's put together some disads on this topic. It's like, budget disad. They're like, oh, wait. Even though it's economic engagement, very few AFs will actually spend any money. Mexico is probably the country most likely to spend a bunch of money. If yes, then obviously spending American dollars is bad. We're broke. We don't need to spend any more. That could certainly be a disad. Basically, AF spends money, Neg says, don't spend any money. Yes, ma'am?
But what about all those banks that insure your money?
Well, those aren't, the cool thing about those is those aren't American dollars, and spending money is not, there's lots of literature that says we shouldn't spend money. There's very little literature that's like insuring things hurts our economy. But yeah, if there was a section of AFs that are like provide insurance for development in Cuba, then you could definitely say insurance hurts our economy. You can't over-insure stuff like that. Do I? I think that an AF has to have the United States insure it. Because I don't know what it's the United States federal government should. So I don't think an affirmative could be like, the United States should ask the World Bank to insure all investment in Cuba. I don't think that's meeting the resolution. So, you know, we could have a good tea debate. For those who have not debated before, that's probably not an example of an affirmative. If no, then who cares? And why spend any? I don't think spending money is a good way to write an affirmative. Anytime you can avoid spending money, you probably want to. Politics. I judged 16 debates on last year's topic in high school debate. 16. I judged one dissent. It was the transportation topic. Basically, there's a huge category of disads, and I don't mean it's the only disad as in it's the only disad you read, but it's my way of saying that it is the only disad that really anyone tends to read, and you need to popularize it because it definitely links to this topic. It is an argument that says that the political repercussions for doing the affirmative are bad. Example, Obama is trying to get immigration reform done. It will be difficult, if not impossible, for the administration to accomplish anything. A good way for them to get sidetracked and not accomplish that would be to lift the embargo on Cuba in the middle of the negotiations over immigration. It is popular because it is somewhat related to the AF, without actually being all that related to the AF, and it is the category of disadvantage that's the most popular. The reasons why the plan on this topic would be politically unpopular. First, why fix their problems? We have problems here. This is basically the Tea Party argument against all economic aid, economic engagement. Got to fix your house before you help out your neighbor. There's a hole in your roof. You don't spend your time fixing theirs. The Buy America provisions that I talked about are very politically popular. There are a lot of people who hate free trade that don't think, you know, there's two categories. There's the globalists who think that what's good for the U.S. is good for China, and we should think as one economy and quit thinking about just us. And then there's a lot of people that are like, they took our jabs, you know, like that South Park. You should watch it. It's great. Buy America's bad. Cuban nationals. For years and years and years, the Cuban embargo has existed, and we have not traded with Cuba for one reason and one reason only. There are a ton of Cubans in Florida and New Jersey, and they hate Castro. Why do I care that they're all in Florida and New Jersey? They are swing states in our election. Carter, after he was out of office, who has his office down, who has his library down the street and talks at Emory every year, said that he was instructed as president to never say anything positive about Cuba, or else it would just be political suicide. Immigration and remittances fears. People don't like. No, there's a fear of immigration. There's a fear of better ties with these countries and with these governments and immigration, and particularly as an immigration debate is going on in Congress. And do we really want to interact all that positively with Mexico and Cuba, and fears of them, sending money back? There's a lot of, pro-Americanism, border shutting. And finally, Venezuela is friends with Iran, for good's sakes. They're friends with Iran. It's just like a political no-no these days. Yeah, it's like, why would you be friends with someone who's friends with your enemy? These are all just examples of why on this year's topic I think one of the big disads is that any action that you can take is going to be politically unpopular with a whole bunch of groups of people. This will be the briefest, if not the most complicated section of this lecture. I'm just going to talk about some of the philosophical questions that are disads to engaging. The first is capitalism or neoliberalism. Neoliberalism is a phrase that used to refer to an economic theory. It's really become sort of like a negative or a pejorative term that you would use to describe an economic system. It's a term of condemnation employed by critics of liberalizing economic tendencies. It's basically profit and greed over other stuff. Every time you hear the phrase neoliberalism, think, oh, they're saying greedy corporations make decisions. The problem with economic engagement means that our businesses will go into these countries, our businesses make bad decisions. Should we be sending in our businesses is a foundational philosophical question. Basically, the drive to make money is usually at the expense of the value of human life, is sort of the big philosophical question that's going on in academic literature right now. The Wall Street movement, the sit-ins that happened, it was a protest against neoliberalism, and now we have a debate topic that asks you, hey, shouldn't we engage more in these countries with our economic model? I saw a hand pop up. Did I answer it?
Can you explain neoliberalism?
The only thing that every time you see neoliberalism, for the purposes of debate, you should translate that to economic greed and profit-driven decision-making. It actually refers to an attempted laissez-faire. It's got a big fancy history and stuff like that. But it's just sort of like what they mean when they're saying it is that when the decisions are made, they're made by businesses for the expense of the CEOs and not for the workers or other people, etc. And so neoliberalism is businesses at the expense of human worker value. Yes?
Are they interchangeable?
What?
Neoliberalism and capitalism?
No, they are not. Capitalism is not used in that pejorative sense. It is by some, but basically you don't read neoliberalism without it being meant very negatively in the past year. In fact, many people will say that capitalism has become dominated by neoliberal tendencies. Might be a sentence that you would read. So capitalism is just sort of like the open market of the economy, and it can be controlled and manipulated in a certain way. Neoliberalism is a way of thinking that is greed and profit-driven that is manipulated capitalism. And then there will be some people who say, yes, they are the same thing. It's like, absolutely, capitalism is always neoliberal. And then there will be other people that are like, well, no, there's nothing intrinsic about capitalism that, that's a complicated answer to his question, but it's a complicated question. Western model is bad is another philosophical question. Development. If someone needs to develop, it means they're not quite fully developed, or they're underdeveloped, or they're inadequate. You need to develop. Sounds to me like you need to grow up. It's very pejorative term. It's a phrase that appears a lot. Philosophical question of when we have a human development chart of countries, and we're like, Mexico is only 42% developed. What are we saying about that country? Human rights is sort of another model that a lot of people criticize, that there were a lot of countries absent from the discussion of human rights. And basically just like economic engagement is a Trojan horse. Does everyone know what Trojan horse means? It's like a hidden way of sneaking in our values into these other countries and doing stuff.
Founded by the Greeks.
Founded by the Greeks. You give me a word, I'll tell you its root in Greek. Okay. And then foreign policy flaws, basically security, indicts of our foreign policy assumptions, the way we make decisions about, which thing to securitize, which country to improve upon. We make decisions based on avoiding wars, not improving lives. That's going to be a huge chunk. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about that, but I wanted to include it as a philosophical question that people are going to ask on this topic, which is like, anytime you start talking about foreign policy, there are people who are like, well, why do we choose who to engage in? Why do we make certain decisions? Stuff like that. For this section of your notes, you can just kind of put a huge asterisk, and John Turner will be giving a lecture on it on Thursday. He's going to go into a lot of details, all of that, but they are important topical things. All right, section 6 is my Cuba section of the topic. I threw up a little map of Cuba. I also threw up a little map of the Caribbean Sea that you can see. Cuba right there to Miami, and then right there to the Dominican. It's really close. Cuba is very close to the United States. In fact, the thing that really drove home to me how close Cuba is there's a law that says you can't drill for oil within so much space of the U.S. coast. So it's like, if I want to drill for oil off the coast of Georgia, I have to go off so many miles. Okay? That number of miles, which is our territory, is further away than Cuba is. If Cuba starts drilling for oil off their coast that they are allowed domestic access to, it will be the closest oil drill to U.S. coastline in the history of oil drilling. In other words, as far as navigational rights, we have rights to 100 miles out from our coast. Technically, Cuba is within that. People can get from Cuba to Miami in unmotored boats all of the time. They do it. It's very close. A couple of demographic facts. I'm going to kind of blow through these other than sounding intelligent about Cuba. You don't really need to know these for debate purposes, but it is the part that I enjoy reading about the most because, it's officially the Republic of Cuba. According to a 2010 census, there are 11 million people in Cuba. There are 2.2 million of those 11 million people live in the capital city of Havana. Cuba is one of the least urbanized countries in the world. And what that means, urbanized, means how populated are the cities versus the rural areas. After Cuba, after Havana at 2.2 million people, the second largest city is 480,000 people, which is very small, like major city standards. And so I have to put together a bunch of cities under 500,000 to add up to 11 million people on a very small island for 11 million population. It's very diverse, very rural, very agricultural. It has an incredibly low population growth rate. It's actually a negative growth rate. That means how much is the population expected to grow. Over the last decade, the growth rate is 1.43 children per woman, which over the long run means that the population is going down. It has to be 2 to replace the population because it takes 2 human beings to have a baby. If they only have 1 baby, 2 have become 1, math goes down. If 2 become 5, population goes up. Cuba has been negative for quite a while, which means unlike a lot of countries, the number of people in Cuba has been on a steady decline for a while. A little bit of political history about the island. It was populated by Native American groups, the Taona and the Chibone. 1492, Columbus landed in Cuba. Through negotiations by 1511, it became a Spanish protectorate, a colony of Spain from 1511 to 1898. It remained Spanish for the longest of any of the islands. The Spanish often refer to Cuba as La Siempre Fidelísima Isla, the always most faithful island. Why did they stay under Spanish control for so long? Because Cuba was largely agricultural. As such, they imported a ton of slaves. By the way, a lot of them were Chinese slaves. They also were afraid of the United States, which was a growing power. And in particular, as a small island, they were very afraid of pirates. Pirates are scary, dude.
The Ottomans.
So, in addition, for this reason, Cuba had a bunch of fears. Instead of, demanding independence far longer than the rest of the islands, because of the population thing and the proximity to the U.S., they just stayed faithful. In 1868, so 30 years before independence, Carlos Manuel de Céspedes started a revolt, but he didn't have anyone to revolt with. So he freed all of his slaves and said, "You are free as long as you fight with me and join my army."
You have a lot of slaves.
And then he passed a law that said that any slave who is willing to become a member of my army is a free man. Only if you fight for me. And if you desert, you're a slave again. So it wasn't a very effective method, but it was the first sort of call for that. In 1878, he agreed. He ended the battle. But Spain agreed that they could become a lot more autonomous. They actually sort of stopped taxing them and stuff like that. In 1898, the Spanish-American War ended with the Treaty of Paris. They were fighting over Cuba, and they gave up Guam, Puerto Rico, the Philippines, and Cuba, all to the United States. To some degree, we were given control of all of those areas. You will notice that Guam, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines are all still protectorates of the United States. They all have groups that are represented in the U.S. Congress. They're considered protectorates. Cuba is not. Cuba, which had more autonomy over Spain, was not given full and complete rights. On May 20th of 1902, Cuba got absolute independence from U.S. control. They were like, we're free. The United States no longer had control over them. We kept the protectorate of the others, but Cuba was let go. As part of that agreement, we agreed to the Platt Amendment. Can anyone tell me why the Platt Amendment is important? You see in the literature all the time, yeah.
It maintained a certain degree of U.S. control over Cuba.
Well, do you know the name of the place that we still have control over?
Guantanamo.
The Guantanamo Bay was given to us. We're like, okay, you can be free, but we want this little part of the island. It's Guantanamo Bay. It belongs to us. We basically own a corner of Cuba. It was agreed to in part of the Platt Amendment. Things stayed like that from 1902 until 1940, with us having a naval base there. Fulgencio Batista was democratically elected president in the elections of 1940. In 1952, Batista, who we really liked and supported, banned communism on the island. He's like, no more communism, go away. It is illegal to be a communist here. People didn't like that. In 1956, a group of 26 men left an island off Mexico. They were going to establish a military rebellion and take over Cuba. Batista claimed and told the United States, I have killed all 26 of those men. I have shot them dead. They did not succeed. A New York Times journalist found Fidel Castro, who was one of the people on the boat, alive and well on the island, wrote a bunch of articles about Mr. Fidel Castro, and he became world famous. He was like a ghost. Batista said he killed him. He didn't kill him. I mean, he's like Rambo. You know, think about it. If you were living on Cuba and you had someone coming to save you, and then this leader was like, I killed all of them, and all of a sudden, oh, he's not dead. It's like a movie. And he became very famous internationally. In 1959, Castro, who had gathered the military and the people who wanted communism, which Batista had tried to ban, took over Havana. The U.S. immediately misread Castro. They were told that he was free of communism, free of the taint of communism. They were like, we support you.
Wasn't a mystery. He wasn't a communist in 1959.
He wasn't a communist.
No, Raul was a communist in 1959, but Castro only really gradually came around to communism, mostly because they needed the Soviet Union.
Yeah, it took him about 6 months to change his tune about communism. In 1960, they're like, hey, maybe the Soviet Union model is a better one for us. His little brother Raul, who was a socialist, who is now the president of Cuba, also hanging out with a guy named Che Guevara. T-shirts, Che. 1961 was a busy year for Cuba. Soviet Union decided they were going to store some missiles there.
62.
Shush up.
Sorry.
Ridiculous. Maybe this is 60. Stephen has suggested this is 62. I thought this was November of 61.
Bay of Pigs, yeah. The missiles don't go there until 62.
Okay. Bay of Pigs, Soviet Union, massive immigration. Basically, the United States declared that Cuban people could get free citizenship. A ton of them left the island and came to the United States, even left their possessions behind. Something you will often hear in the Cuban literature is that a lot of Cuban Americans still claim that they are owed money for their property in Cuba. Kennedy decided to send the CIA into, the Bay of Pigs was a failed attempt to invade. Didn't work, it backfired, there was a huge blockade. A lot of people reference it as the closest the world has ever come to all-out nuclear war between us and the United States over Cuba, which is 50 miles south of Miami. In 1962, in response to this, we started an economic embargo of absolutely no trade with the island of Cuba. It was 1962. The exact same law is still in place. So, 51 years now, just had its 50th anniversary. Same law. Helms-Burton, or the Cuban Liberty and Democratic Solidarity Act of 1996, gave some teeth, gave some power, so it was strengthened. It made it legal for the government or anyone else to sue a U.S. business or company that had any investment in Cuba. Everyone but Israel, us, and South Korea have voted against Helms-Burton as being an illegal act that should be overturned almost every year since 1996. It's one of those things where the United Nations is like, who hates Helms-Burton? All right, that's everybody except for you three. All right, thanks, guys. South Korea has actually voted against it as well in some years, but the United States is always like, we hate it, and Israel is always like, we're with that guy. And everyone else is like, this is terrible law. Yes?
The U.S., Israel, and South Korea?
Yeah, Korea had a vote against it like sometime in I think 98, 99. But we can count, just write Israel. We can count on Israel. And everyone else is like, this is a terrible law. Why are you doing this? It is illegal. It is a violation of all of our trading principles. You cannot just pick a country and just be like, no one trades with them. And if you trade with them, we will sue you. You don't have to trade with them. So the complaint is not you don't have to trade. No one can force me to be nice to Jason. The illegal part is that I am going to sue Julia if she is nice to Jason. The Canadians actually have a law that's like the anti-Helms-Burton law, and it reads something like, we will sue you if you sue us for interacting with Cuba. It's really awesome. Yeah. No, they sue companies. So a lot of U.S. companies have investments in major corporations. So this actually made the embargo a lot more effective in 1996. So let's say that you have stock in Microsoft, and Microsoft is a big major national corporation. It has a lot of American dollars involved in it. We would sue Microsoft if they did anything in Cuba. But we're talking big multinational corporations, and a lot of them in 96 and 97 actually stopped investing in Cuba because they were afraid of the lawsuits. In 2000, they passed the Trade Sanction Reform and Export Enhancement Act of 2000. It dealt with agriculture and some medical technology. And it basically was all of the farmers, particularly in Miami, wanted to sell food. And they basically are so powerful in Congress that they got an exception that said that we can now sell our food and a limited amount of medical equipment to Cuba. So it was an exception to it. Another exception was in 2009. There's a travel and remittances for family members. So if you are a grandmother and you have a grandson in Cuba, you can visit legally as a U.S. citizen now. As of 2009, you can also send money or a remittance back to your family member. The Cuban government taxes your U.S. remittance at a very large rate, and that is something we have been fighting over. On January 16 of 2013, Obama waived the right to sue businesses as part of the Helms-Burton Act. Bush also waived it temporarily in his administration. This has very little to do with Cuba and more to do with all of those countries in the UN telling us we were being evil.
Wait, define wave, like completely.
So it's basically just Obama announcing, we will not sue anyone for trading with Cuba.
Was it like temporary though, or was it like?
It's only for 6 months. It's a 6 months waiver. It says for the next 6 months we will not waive your thing if your corporations are investing. It's basically saying we're not going to do a thing that violates the WTO and every free trade principle that we've ever agreed to, despite what it says, but we're going to keep the right to do so in the future. It's just like a classic U.S. executive move. It's like, we're not going to enforce this now, but we might. Cuba's economy, centrally planned. In 2000, 23% of the population was employed privately, which means they were employed not by the government. That is up from the 1981 percentage of 8%. So in 1981, 92% of the people in Cuba worked for the government. In 2000, roughly 1 out of every 4 has a job that's not with the government. It is slowly becoming less communist, less centrally planned. I was having this side conversation with Stephen. Cuba controls the media in Cuba. Raul determines what is printed. Most people don't have access to things like personal computers, which means a lot of the data and information we get out of Cuba, there's a set of people that are saying, we don't know if that's true or not, because when you go to visit Cuba, you're taken on a national tour, you're taken to the pretty parts, you're not allowed to go to some of the areas. In fact, that census of 11 million people in Cuba, they were like, we don't trust you. That birth rate of 1.43 children per woman, there are members that are like, how do we know that? We can't go in there and verify. It is illegal to use the US dollar in or for Cuban purposes as part of the embargo. This has made it very difficult for Cuba to do things with international organizations because a lot of them use the dollar. So our currency is the international currency for all purposes, but it's illegal for them to use the dollar. So a lot of international organizations like the World Bank, instead of fearing pissing off the United States, have just said, sorry Cuba, no deals for you. Yes, ma'am.
So if there's no use of the US dollar, it's illegal completely in Cuba? Or
It's legal to what? It's legal to what?
is the use of the US dollar completely illegal in Cuba?
Yeah, Cuba responded by saying, well, the dollar is also illegal.
Okay, so how
Anytime we, that's a, you didn't ask this question, it's a total sidebar. Every time we do something that says it's legal, Fidel for years would be like, it's illegal to do that too. So it's like, you can't eat American corn in Cuba, U.S. citizens. And Fidel would be like, Cuban citizens, if you're caught eating American corn, you will be put in jail. It's like, haha, I'll tell you, it's totally silly. So you can, so let's say you have a Cuban brother. You can send him money, like a financial transaction, like Western Union, but they're not allowed to do it in the dollar. That makes any sense. In the same way that you may send money to your brother in Italy, they would print it out in the euro, and there would be a transaction rate, but internationally they can't operate with the dollar, which means if things are traded and there has to be a transaction into dollar. So the World Bank, they'll take everything, they convert it to the dollar, then they do the transaction, they do it, the World Bank can't do that for Cuba.
Okay.
Yes.
So then Cuban companies would be like almost entirely crippled in the global economy?
Yes. That's why they're friends with Iran. You know, that's why they're friends. The Netherlands are their #1 trading partner for a reason, because they just don't care. Boom, Netherlands, top trading partner. Fact. Okay, next, U.S.-Cuban relations. What relations? I mean, we've had the same embargo for over 50 years. It started on February 7th, 1962. My mother's birthday is February 7th, so I included that fact. Obama has a list of requirements. He has publicly stated the embargo is in place until Cuba gets rid of their transaction fees. So if I send a remittance to my brother, it is taxed and there's a transaction fee. He says that must go away. He says there must be free telecommunication industry support, that they must allow the establishment of telecommunication. They must eliminate and get rid of all political prisoners, all people who are under arrest for political violation. And they have to improve their human rights record. Quit violating the human rights of their citizens. He has said if they meet those things, he will fight to get rid of the embargo. Raul has said, we'll see about it, which is a major improvement over Fidel, who has said, we want the embargo.
So there's no guarantee that he'll actually get the embargo lifted?
Oh, yeah. I mean, as part of the Helms-Burton Act of 1996, I should have said this, the president cannot just get rid of the embargo. Obama can't just sign a sheet of paper. It's like, embargo no more. Congress has to act and the president has to sign a removal of the embargo.
Would that be a time frame issue though, then? Like, after someone gets elected, would that policy change?
Well, Obama, when he was running for president, he is the first elected president since the 60s to have said he was against the embargo.
So
The president saying that he's against something and that happening, that's a bit of the sticky wicket.
So the fact that he's actually taking a step to say that it's bad is a step forward.
It's a huge step forward. The first president ever to be elected by saying that he was anti-embargo. And he did. He said, I think the embargo is bad. I think we should look into it.
Why have the other past presidents been against or have been for the embargo?
New Jersey and Florida, Obama saw a changing of the political winds. So two things are largely happening as far as the Cuban vote. One, the Cuban American population is getting a lot older. So this embargo has existed for 50 years. So the number of Cubans who lived in Cuba and came over in the 60s is obviously getting smaller and smaller and smaller. And as Cubans are becoming older who can vote, they are far less anti-Castro, pro-embargo than they used to be. So that change has happened. Second is they, as a population percentage, are growing much smaller just in general. So Obama won Florida in his first election despite being sort of neutral embargo. And his second election, he was like, I think we should lift the embargo. If it was up to me, I probably would, and I would work with them to get rid of the embargo. And despite that, he won Florida anyway. And then sidebar, he didn't even need to win Florida to win the election. So it's just like a lot is changing demographically. They're losing some power and that sort of stuff. There's also a growing group of people in this country who are voting who dislike the embargo. Yes?
So where's the political adage saying anti-embargo when you only have 4 years left, and this is obviously not going to be entirely achieved in 4 years?
The big thing is he just couldn't get it lifted.
So why do you
He just couldn't. If he was like, let's get rid of the embargo, every member of the House would be like, no. And if you're the representative from Wyoming, you don't care. It doesn't bother you either way. And you've got this person in Florida who's a Republican with you who really hates it. You're just going to stick with them. All right, just a quick section on Cuba and how I think it relates to debate. There's very good affirmative evidence for this act. There are a ton of people who hate the embargo. It is a lot of fun. I kind of wish the topic was resolved Cuba. There's also lots of recent literature, given the two major things that have happened. One is that, Fidel has died, Raul has replaced him. Even though Raul, as Stephen has pointed out in the notes, it's like, even though he was the original communist, he has always been far more willing to negotiate with the United States. We've also elected a president who is more pro-Cuba. He was willing to meet with Chavez. Being anti-Cuba is not politically salient, which means there's lots of really good stuff coming out. A lot of the cards in the starter packet about Cuba are from 2012, 2013. It's really new and recent stuff. This is a phrase I want you to asterisk. PICS, Plan Inclusive Counterplans, which means the Cuba debate is going to be a lot about, well, maybe we shouldn't totally engage Cuba. Maybe we should engage Cuba with like a few exceptions. How about we engage Cuba, but we don't send them this stuff? Or how about we do engage Cuba, but we only do it for telecommunication? How about we engage Cuba, but only for medical stuff? Part of the problem is we're doing nothing with Cuba. And so the affirmative is going to be, how about just this or just that or just this little bit? And the negative is going to be like, well, maybe not everything, maybe a little bit. I'll take quick questions and I've got to get on the other area. Yeah.
So PICS is a permutation?
No. PICS is just an acronym. Plan, inclusive, counterplans.
So what is that?
This is a type of counterplan which the negative reads. So if you read the affirmative and said, open up all trade with Cuba, a negative strategy that will be popular is me saying, open up all non-agricultural trade with Cuba. That is a much better way of engaging. A permutation is you saying, we should do both of those when you're affirmative. You're testing whether it's competitive. Bill's going to talk about counterplans. I didn't mean to conclude you. I just wanted a quick phrase of me telling you that a big part of the Cuba debate is how much engagement should we do and with what.
We'll talk about more in lab too.
Everybody talks about Cuba. Everybody loves to talk about Cuba. There's a really great card that I didn't include because I thought it would be strapped for time here, and I am. It's just like, Cuba is the most talked about topic ever. Whenever we show up, people talk about it. They also recently found some oil in Cuba. Oil. Love to talk about oil. There will also be lots of smaller things. We don't have to totally open up Cuba. We could just sell cell phones to Cuba. How about just allowing travel to Cuba? How about just allowing auto sales to Cuba? There's lots of small things we can engage in and make changes, and that'll be a huge part of the debate. I only have about 15 minutes left, so I'm going to try to go through Mexico a little quicker. Current demographic facts about Cuba. It's technically the United Mexican States. It has 113 million people. It is the largest Spanish-speaking country in the world. Most populated Spanish-speaking country in the world. Anybody know the only Latin American country with more people? Brazil, which is not included. It's the 10th most visited country in the world, which I did not know. 22.5 million people visit Mexico every year, most of them for spring break. Some of the oldest human remains ever found were found in Mexico 23,000 years ago. They started the cultivation of maize, which is a variety of corn in Mexico. Began the agricultural movement. Lots of old people there. 1519, Spanish began the conquest over the Aztecs. His leader was Montezuma. A lot of the Spanish killed them with diseases. The Spanish then got dysentery. That is where we get the phrase Montezuma's revenge. Google that. Smallpox killed more than 3 million Mexicans. The priests that were there told the Mexicans that the reason they were dying of smallpox is because they hadn't accepted Jesus Christ. The Spanish were not dying from smallpox because smallpox had been popular in Spain for centuries, and so they were kind of immune. So it was literally a disease where all the Spanish people seemed to be immune to, and all of the Mexicans were dying from. And the message was, you are dying because you're not Christian. And it was the fastest, most comprehensive change to Christianity in the history of the world. Because imagine, you're sitting there, and you're dying of a disease, and all of your members are sick, and here are these Christians who are not sick at all, and they're telling you this. I thought this, As far as religious history stuff goes, it's pretty interesting. 1821, independence from Spain. 1824, Texas and some other places called for it. 1846, there was a war between Mexico and America. 1848, we paid $15 million to Mexico, and we got all the way down to Rio Grande, all of Texas, all of California, all of New Mexico, all of Arizona, all of Nevada, all of Utah, parts of Wyoming, and Colorado. We gave them an extra $10 million for that, parts of Wyoming and California. That was all purchased from the Mexicans in 1848 for roughly $25 million. In other words, a huge chunk of the United States was purchased from the Mexicans as a result of the end of this war. Everyone who lived there was given the right to become a U.S. citizen, and they could stay where they were and given full citizen rights. Roughly 90% of the population stayed. Roughly 10% just were like, we're just going to go south and remain Mexican. But a huge percentage stayed. 1910, there was a Mexican Revolution because they thought the people who were being elected were cheating. They've had ridiculously good growth in Mexico. The economy's gotten much better, but poverty rates and inequality has stayed high. In January of 94, like New Year's Day, they started NAFTA, which I've talked about. Started a rebellion called the Zapatista Rebellion. Soon after, the economy collapsed. Definitely unrelated. The U.S. sent a giant stimulus package to Mexico. Clinton helped write it and give it. It rebounded by 1999 and was growing again. 1970, they're just like us. Oh yeah, there are three. Cuba is a lot like us politically. They have the three branches. They have three big parties that exist. Most people in Mexico will tell you that they're a member of one of these three political parties. The National Action Party, which is right-wing, Institutional Revolutionary Party, which is like the moderates, and then the Democratic Revolution, which is an extremely left-wing group. And then 1986, founding and successor of the Coalition of Socialist and Liberal Parties. 14th largest economy in the world, so they're big. Goldman Sachs has a prediction that says that by 2050, Mexico is predicted to become the 5th largest economy. This is because their economy is growing, their infrastructure is getting better, and most importantly, they're just sort of developing strong economic policies. They're expected to grow. A bunch of other countries that are European on that list are slowly starting to decline. So as is, Mexico's already supposed to jump way up. Despite that, 46% of all people living in Mexico are living in what the Mexican government defines as poverty. It has the highest discrepancy in infant mortality, which means that usually as a country's income gets better, the less infants die. That has not been happening in Mexico. There's lots of stuff that's like infant mortality is just like really high, and they don't know why. I talked about sticky power. 1 out of every 2 things purchased in Mexico come from the United States or Canada. We're their first and second trading partner, and number 3 is very far away. So of every dollar, 2% of its entire GDP is made up of remittances from the United States. 0.2% of their entire economy is just money that people send into Mexico from the United States. Also, they're the largest auto producer in North America, which a lot of people don't know. Ford, Chrysler, and GM produce a majority of their cars in Mexico.
They just moved Detroit to Mexico.
They moved Detroit to Mexico. They did. It's still there, but all the jobs aren't. NAFTA, North American Free Trade, Article 27. There was an article in the Mexican Constitution that said that indigenous Indians didn't have to accept the goods of anyone they didn't want to. NAFTA rewrote the Mexican Constitution. There's a big rebellion about it. There's concerns about agricultural dumping, which is the United States just selling tons and tons and tons of corn into Mexico. And who is that bad for? Mexican corn farmers. Basically, we just oversell it. We have subsidies and they don't. A subsidy is when we pay our farmers money to grow there. And then there's also industry migration. Will has already said it. The phrase is Detroit got moved to Mexico. That doesn't mean that like the city of Detroit is now located in Mexico. It's just that all of the jobs that used to be in Detroit now are jobs that exist in Mexico because it's free trade, it's cheaper labor, it's easier access to stuff. They provided a bunch of economic aid to us after 9/11 and Katrina. Despite that, they refused to be a part of the war of terror. We're their #1 trading partner. They're #3 for us. Walmart, #1 employer in Mexico. If you know someone who lives in Mexico, there's a 23% chance they work for Walmart. War on drugs is there, immigration is there. Interesting things about debate in Mexico. First, ton of economic engagement in Mexico now. The list of everything we're doing is ridiculous. We're just doing a ton of it. Advantages won't be as good as Cuba, but the disads aren't going to be as good either. Cuba's the place you're going to go if you want to avoid debate. Mexico's the place you're going to want to go if you don't want to have a lot of really good debates. If you want lots of really, really good cards for both the app and the negative, Cuba. If you want a bunch of debates where you're like, oh, but we're already doing so much, the plan is just this small little difference, Mexico's the debate for you. Immigration is interesting. If immigration reform actually happens in this Congress, the Mexican debate will change a lot. War on drugs is a huge part of our relationship with Mexico, and Mexico has been fighting with us in a lot of international organizations, voting against us, stuff like that. Venezuela, that's their flag, that's Chavez, that's one of Chavez's campaign posters, like fight the imperialists of North America, vote Chavez. That's just proof of the anti-Americanism thing that I was talking about. And then that's where Venezuela is located. Yes, sir. Oh yeah, and his face is superposed on there. Oh yeah, I think that's his actual campaign poster. It's like, vote Chavez. Let's see, 29 million people, very urbanized. It's the opposite of Cuba. Cuba, they're not a bunch of big cities. In Venezuela, it's almost all big cities. And they all live in that north part near Caracas, which is the capital. There are 23 states, including the federal district. While Spanish is the official language, there's actually 30 different indigenous languages spoken in the greater Venezuela area. Like Cuba and Mexico, the Spanish killed a ton of them with smallpox. Thanks, Spain. 1993, they impeached their president. In 1998, they elected Hugo Chavez. He rewrote the Constitution. He just died on March 5th. 3 days later, they had an election. They elected Nicolas Maduro. He's the first one to be elected since Chavez was after the revolution. So, major revolution. Elect Chavez. Chavez is in power. Chavez is in power. Chavez is in power. He just died. Finally had their second president since the new Constitution. They are poor. Mexico's 11th. They're 85th. If you were in Cuba, you would have to have some Bolivar in your wallet. Citgo is owned and operated by the government of Venezuela. So if you stop and get gas at Citgo, it's the Venezuelan government economy. So while we don't trade a ton with Venezuela, we do trade a ton of oil with Venezuela. It is the largest known reserves of oil in the world. Middle East, Canada, everywhere. 297 billion. In 2007, they reported they only had 99 billion. They went back in with better technology, and they were like, we were off by about 200 billion. Turns out we've got a ton of oil. This oil has been verified by all the members of OPEC. They have it. Venezuela's a member. They've got a ton of oil. That's why it's going to be important. In 2002, it's disputed about whether we attempted to start a coup against Chavez. Chavez says he has proof. Obviously, the U.S. denies it. There was like almost a year where we refused to recognize Venezuela. In Russia, after 9/11, Chavez gave a speech that referred to the United States as the greatest terrorist in the history of the world. Despite hating each other, we did $40.4 billion in trade in 2005. A lot of people who talk about Chavez say the biggest irony is that he got elected on hating America, but his palace was paid for by Americans. It's sort of like, we hate America, they're evil. Shh, don't tell anyone, but we're selling a ton of stuff to them, particularly our oil. Right now, the problem with Venezuela, and it's actually going to be first on the debate, is that there's just not a ton of literature as compared to Mexico and Cuba. Ton of stuff about Cuba because people like to talk about it. Ton of stuff about Mexico because they're our third largest trading partner. There's just not as much out there about Venezuela. It's been very disappointing. All of the debate coaches that I've talked to who are like doing work are like, dude, let's talk about Venezuela, are disappointed by the lack of literature. Where it's also just an interesting part. I mean, Chavez is gone. We kind of don't know if Maduro is going to be pro-America. Is he going to be as anti-American as Chavez? You actually can't be more anti-American than Chavez is. I mean, he's like the greatest terrorist in the history of the oil world. But the interesting thing about Venezuela is they do have oil, sweet, sweet oil. And they've got a lot of it, which means we care about them, and we buy a ton of oil from Venezuela. Anytime oil's involved, it's fun to debate. If you're into finding really obscure cards, Venezuela is the debate for you. There's just not a ton of literature about there, which means I don't think it's going to be debated as much, despite the fact, and when it is debated, it's going to be a lot about oil. There's actually good literature that the best way to improve relations with Venezuela is to remove the Cuban embargo.
Wait, why?
It was one of Chavez's rallying cries. It's something that all people in Latin America hate about us, that we're basically just bullying this country with a population the size of like less than the size of Florida, and we've just embargoed them, and they call us a hypocrite and say that we're telling countries like Venezuela, free trade, trade everything, be awesome. No, not with Cuba. Don't do that. They're evil. Yes?
Isn't there a lot of oil in the rainforest, and that's why they're not drilling it, because there's a lot of...
A lot on the coast, a lot in the rainforest. Other questions about the topic? Last chance. Yes, ma'am.
Didn't you say the Amazon was in Venezuela?
It is. The top of it is up there. Venezuela is considered ultra diverse by the WWF. It's one of the 5 most biologically diverse countries in the world. Sorry, I know this is one more second. I know this is kind of like boring stuff, and all of the history is interesting, if not useful. Have lots of questions for your lab leaders. Good luck with Latin America. Be back at lab at 1.